coming. I would like to welcome you all to this evening's event, where we will be examining the military relations between Israel, the Netherlands, and the EU. It has been organized by several organizations, the Diensten en Onderzoekcentrum Palestina, or DocP, Stop Wapenhandel, and Studenten voor Rechtvaardigheid in Palestina. Diensten en Onderzoek Palestina, DocP, is a 3.5-year-old non-profit organization bringing together many organizations and individuals in the Netherlands focused on justice for Palestine and BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions in particular. DocP supports the 2005 call signed by more than 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, such as trade unions, student groups, women's organizations, and more, to deploy nonviolent resistance in the form of a broad boycott campaign in support of Palestinian human rights and an end to the Israeli occupation. Campaigns in which DocP is active include the boycott of Israeli dates, supermarket inspections of Israeli products, and divestment from G4S. Other areas of focus include the Netherlands' military relations and tourism in Israel. Stop the Wapenhandel, or Stop the Arms Trade, is a non-profit organization that does research and takes action on weapons exports and the weapons trade. They have published numerous reports available on their website, including a newly released report on the Netherlands' military relations with Israel titled Combat Proven. They are active in protesting weapons fairs and the shareholders' meetings of large military corporations such as Airbus, and call for pension funds to divest from these corporations. Studenten voor Rechtvaardigheid in Palestina, or Students for Justice in Palestine, is a new and quickly growing organization started by students initially at the FU and now with chapters at the University of Amsterdam, Maastricht, Rotterdam, Utrecht, Groningen, and elsewhere. They are focused on the university's relations with Israeli apartheid and call for stopping academic exchange programs with Israel, breaking ties with the university and Israeli companies that profit from the occupation, and the end of formal partnerships with Israeli academic institutions until Israel respects Palestinian human rights and complies with international law. For tonight's program, we have a special guest, Shir Hever. Mr. Hever is a journalist, economist, and researcher with the Alternative Information Center, AIC, a Palestinian-Israeli research organization active in Jerusalem and Beit Sahur. He has many publications, including a book on the political economy of Israel's occupation, published by Pluto Press in 2010. He has also given many lectures and interviews, such as for the Real News Network. He is currently working on a doctoral dissertation at the Freie University in Berlin, examining Israel's military industry, arms exports, and how Israel's military occupation fits into global interests. Shir Hever will speak about 45 minutes. Then we will have short presentations from Benjamin, a student at the University of Amsterdam and researcher at Stop Wapenhandel, who will speak about the new report just released titled Combat Proven. Following Benjamin, we will hear from Thomas, a student at the FU and with Student for Rechtvaardigheid Palestina, who will speak about the relations between Israeli universities and Israel's military-industrial complex and the need for an academic boycott. The remaining 30 minutes will be dedicated to a discussion between the panelists and questions from the audience. A few ground rules for this evening. We ask the audience to be respectful and keep their questions and comments short and to the point. Anyone disrupting the event will be asked to leave. Afterwards, we welcome you to our literature table, where you can find more information about the topic and the groups that have organized this event, and including Shir Hever's book is available for sale for €15. And now, please join me in welcoming Shir Hever.
Thank you very much for coming this evening and for this wonderful introduction and for your interest in Palestine. I want to talk to you this evening about the Israeli arms industry, the Israeli arms export, from the point of view of the Israeli actors themselves who are engaged in this industry, what motivates them, how this industry developed, And towards the end, I will try to bring it a little bit closer here to ask how this reflects on decisions of activists who want to protest the Israeli arms trade, and what can we learn from understanding it from its special characteristics. Okay, so starting with a brief history of the arms industry, we actually see a very interesting development in how that industry changed over the years. The Israeli arms industry started before there was a state of Israel. It started as a group, as a cluster of factories that were producing weapons for the Jewish militias active in Palestine, trying to take over Palestine. And at the time, it was a very ideological kind of industry. So the point was not to make money by selling weapons. The point was to arm the various Jewish armed groups, the Zionist armed groups. And whatever money was made by selling excess weapons or by selling old weapons that were no longer needed was channeled for arms research, for further strengthening of the Israeli armed forces. And that trend continued into the first years of the State of Israel. And over time, we see more and more the idea of the business logic coming into these companies, coming into these factories. It's not only selling excess and unnecessary weapons and exporting them, but it becomes the main purpose of these factories, these companies, to produce for export. And up to the point, what we can see today is that the Israeli army itself is armed with particular weapons and systems in order to boost the exports. And I'll get back to that point. So in the first years of the Israeli arms industry, we see a very interesting argument between two schools of thought. And these are the schools of thought that I like to call the specialization school of thought and the self-sufficiency school of thought. And these are two philosophies about what kind of arms industry the State of Israel wants. The specialization school was headed for many years by a very outspoken person called Yitzhak Rabin, who later became the famous Prime Minister of Israel. And he argued that the Israeli arms industry should not try to produce everything, but only specialize on particular technologies which they can do best, and then also export these technologies, and use the money to buy various other weapons and systems that they are not capable of producing locally, but can supplement from outside. And this would cultivate the Israeli relative advantage in certain kinds of technologies. But the other school of thought was headed by also a famous Israeli politician called Shimon Peres, who was also Prime Minister of Israel and President. And he argued that what Israel really needs is to be completely self-sustaining, not reliant on imports. And that means that the Israeli arms industry has to produce everything. The guns, the vehicles, the ammunition, so that it does not have to import anything unless it wants to. And these two groups of military officers and politicians argued with each other. They could not reach an agreement for many years. In the war of 1967, in which Israel conquers a very large territory, including, of course, the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza Strip, which it controls until today, this is a moment which changes this argument between the two sides. Because the biggest supplier of weapons to Israel up until 1967 was France. And France decided that unless Israel withdraws from the occupied territory, it will impose an arms embargo and stop selling weapons to Israel. And as soon as the decision by France becomes known, the Israeli government has to decide. Are they going to end the occupation and be able to buy French weapons as before? Or are they going to continue the occupation and then lose their biggest supplier? And they chose to lose their supplier. They chose to continue the occupation, and that means they also chose the self-sustaining school, the self-sustaining philosophy, meaning they tried to produce everything. So in the year 1967, we see a massive government investment in creating a very large arms industry in Israel. This is where it really begins, with the attempt for the Israeli arms industry to produce artillery, ships, airplanes, tanks, everything. And they failed. They failed miserably. They did not have the engineering capacity to build all these things. Most of these projects did not succeed at all. But everything, of course, changed again in 1973. 1973 is when the United States, in the middle of the war between Israel, Syria, and Egypt, decides to start sending very large amounts of military aid to Israel. And that proves that there is no military embargo, quite the opposite. And from that moment, the school of self-sustaining in Israel has collapsed completely and was replaced by the specialization school. So if we talk about the US military aid to Israel, the most important moment in the development of the Israeli arms industry, then we should understand what we're talking about. It's aid to the tune of about $3 billion every year. And this is the biggest aid that the United States gives to any other country in the world. Number 2, by the way, is Egypt, with about $1.8 billion per year. So Israel is the biggest recipient of aid by far. But the aid is not really money. And that's something very important to understand. The United States doesn't give Israel any money. It gives the Israeli government vouchers. And the vouchers have to be converted to US-made weapons. The Israeli government, like any other recipient of aid from the United States, has to convert to use that aid money to buy from US companies, from the big international companies like Lockheed Martin, McDonnell Douglas, Boeing, and so on. Now, it's true that Israel, unlike other recipients of aid, is allowed to take a very small part of this aid and buy from Israeli companies. That is a unique advantage that only Israel gets, but most of the aid is actually not aid to Israel, it's a subsidy to the US arms industry. And it does not improve the standard of living of Israelis, because the fact that people in Israel have F-16s flying over their heads does not make their lives any better. It does make the life of the US arms companies, the workers and the owners of these companies better, because they have a very big customer. And it should also be, so here's a graph about how this aid developed, and you can see that the aid starts in very early, but in very small very small amounts. Until 1973, it's very minor aid. 1973, during the war, that's when it becomes very, very high. And since that moment, it's more or less stagnant. So it goes up and down, but on average, it doesn't change a lot. What you can see, if you look a bit closer, I don't know if you can see that in the back so much, is that aid is comprised of civilian aid and military aid. Starting from 1996, the civilian aid has decreased steadily and was replaced by military aid. So today there is virtually no civilian aid left. It's almost all military aid. And this is actually because in 1996, Israel's Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, yes, still the same one who is Prime Minister today, he went to the US Congress and asked the US Congress, we need more weapons, please give us for each $2 of civilian aid, $1 of military aid. The US Congress was very happy to hear this request and decided to give Netanyahu an even better deal, 1 for 1. For each $1 of civilian aid, $1 of military aid, because it's a subsidy to the US arms industry, so why not? But very important to understand, if you look at the long term, the US aid to Israel is actually weakened dramatically in real terms, because it's still about $3 billion, maybe a little bit more, 3.1. But what can you buy today with $3 billion or $3.1 billion? And what could you buy in 1973 with $3 billion? That's not the same. The value of the dollar has decreased. The size of the Israeli economy and the size of the US economy have increased dramatically. So actually the aid has eroded, and today the Israeli government spends a lot more than $3 billion every year to buy additional weapons from the United States, because these $3 billion are just not enough for the appetite of the Israeli army. And the aid that the U.S. gives to Israel is not just a gift, not just a present from the kindness of their hearts. It also comes with strings attached. It also comes with restrictions on what Israel can do with the money, but also through that aid, it affects the Israeli arms industry. Every time the Israeli arms industry tries to produce some kind of product which competes with a product produced in the United States government uses the aid in order to discourage that activity and to undermine the project. So when the Rafael Israeli arms company tried to produce anti-tank missiles that were somewhat similar to missiles produced by the United States informed the Israeli government, now as part of the aid you are required to take these free anti-tank missiles. So of course the Israeli military will be equipped with these anti-tank missiles produced by the United States, and Rafael had to stop the project because they could not sell it to the Israeli government. A more famous example is the Lavi airplane, which was an attempt by the Israeli aerospace industries, the biggest arms company in Israel, to produce a fighter plane that could compete with the American F-16. And of course the US arms companies did not like that project at all, and they put a lot of pressure. And after the Israeli government, through this company, invested billions in trying to develop this airplane, they decided to discard the whole project. The plane was never built in order to not annoy or not anger their patrons in Washington. More recent examples include the Palestinian appeal for statehood. I imagine most of you have seen in the news that President Mahmoud Abbas of Palestine tried to get recognition from the Security Council of the United Nations, and there are 9 votes. And because Nigeria abstained, which was very unexpected, Nigeria was was expected to vote in favor of Palestine, but in the last minute they abstained, and the motion was denied. Why did Nigeria abstain? Because it was revealed shortly afterwards that Israel has agreed to provide Nigeria with attack helicopters. These attack helicopters, the Nigerian government is interested in them because of the oil conflict that takes place in Nigeria's oil fields, where the native population living around these oil fields is being dislocated by the Nigerian government. And the United States, in this case under President Obama, was not pleased with the fact that Israel was providing them with attack helicopters that would be used against civilians, and they simply stopped the deal. So after Nigeria already voted, as Israel wanted them to vote, they did not get the helicopters in the end. So next time, I don't think that Nigeria will vote according to Israel's wishes, because now they know that they cannot get the helicopters without US approval. And here I want to get to a very important point about the lobby. The weapons lobby, the Israeli lobby. I guess everybody knows about this myth that the Israeli lobby in the United States somehow has a lot of influence over the White House, over Congress. That AIPAC, the American-Israeli committee, is the Israeli lobby in the United States, and somehow they can control presidents and control senators and so on. That's not true. This is a myth, and sometimes this myth actually borders on anti-Semitic accusations. But nevertheless, we see every election cycle in the United States how the candidates for presidency go to AIPAC. Actually, this year was a very special event that one of the candidates, Bernie Sanders, decided not to go to AIPAC. That was a very unusual decision by him. But because it's very customary for them to go to AIPAC, and in AIPAC, they make a very pandering kind of speech where they say to AIPAC, we will always support Israel. Israel is the closest ally of the United States. We will always promote Israel. And that really contributes to this myth as if somehow AIPAC controls the United States. In terms of budget, AIPAC is not so big. And this graph that you see here shows you the distribution of different lobby groups. I didn't put all the lobbies active in the United States. I only put the weapon lobbies and AIPAC. And so you see that AIPAC, with a budget of $3 million for the year 2014, is a tiny, tiny fraction of compared to the arms lobby, where you see the big weapon companies, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, General Electric, Boeing, Raytheon, and even the British BAE Systems has a much bigger lobby in the United States than AIPAC. But there's a problem with these big arm lobbies because they cannot operate very openly. You don't expect the US presidential candidates to appear before Lockheed Martin, for example, and to tell them, don't worry, if I'm elected president, I will make sure that there will never be peace in the Middle East. That's not going to happen, of course. But if the same presidential candidate goes to AIPAC and says, we are going to support Israel no matter what, the message is the same. If you're supporting the aggressor, it means there's not going to be peace in the Middle East. And the message is heard not just by AIPAC, it's heard mainly by the arms companies. And these are these companies that are spending in 2014 $82 million on supporting candidates for their various campaigns. They want to support the candidates that will make sure that their weapons are going to continue to sell. And there's this very famous quote by Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State of the United States, who said, for every tank that we give to Israel for free, the neighbors of Israel buy 4 tanks from the United States. So that gives us an idea of what kind of interests are operating there. And it's not always in favor of Israeli arms companies, and especially not in favor of the Israeli public. Of course, it's also not in the favor of the Palestinians, who are the bigger losers in this story, because while I'm talking about economic loss, we should always keep in mind that these weapons are actually used against human beings. Okay, so if we look at the Israeli arms exports, one of the developments of how these exports became more and more important to the industry, arms exports, is that Israeli arm companies started to operate very similarly to the way that US arm companies operate. They copied the model of the US companies. And that means that the Israeli Ministry of Defense copies the Pentagon and acts not as a regulator of these companies, trying to control what kind of weapons and who are they selling it to, but acting as a promoter of Israeli weapons, trying to get more markets for the Israeli arms industry. The Ministry of Defense of Israel becomes very independent in order to advance the arms export. That means that the Israeli Ministry of Defense has its own customs agency. So there is the normal customs controlled by the Ministry of Finance, like in any normal country, but there's also a separate customs agency controlled by the Ministry of Defense, and that is in order for the Ministry of Defense to be able to import and export weaponry without reporting it. It doesn't appear in the statistics books, and they can therefore trade with countries that don't even have diplomatic relations with Israel. Now, in Britain, there is a regulation that says that every company that wants to buy British weapons or components for weaponry, they have to report who is their final customer for that technology, the end user certificate. And the UK Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a list of requests by various companies to buy British equipment, and who is the end user of these equipment types. And this report was published in 2011 and caused quite an uproar, because a lot of Israeli companies were buying British weaponry and components and selling it to countries like Algeria and Indonesia and Pakistan and Tunisia. So that's something that caused quite an uproar. Suddenly it was revealed that Israel is trading with all these countries. the Israeli Ministry of Defense only bothered to deny one accusation. It only said, no, we don't sell weapons to Pakistan. And of course, the reason for that is that today Israel's biggest arms customer is India. And the Indian government reacted immediately upon hearing that the Israeli companies are selling weapons to Pakistan and was demanded an immediate response. So the Ministry of Defense only responded to that issue, but they did not bother to deny the fact that they are actually trading with a lot of countries that they don't have diplomatic relations with. That's part of how that arms industry works. In fact, if you remember that in 2006, Israel invaded Lebanon. I'll get back to that war in a second because it leads to a very interesting story. The war started, this invasion started when the Hezbollah military group, they ambushed an Israeli force moving into Lebanon and took Israeli soldiers prisoner. And when they took the prisoners and ran from the scene of the battle, they left behind the heavy machine gun. So when the Israeli military came to investigate the site of the ambush, they found this heavy machine gun and were surprised to discover that the machine gun used by the Hezbollah had the markings of the Israeli army on it. And they traced it and discovered that this was a machine gun that was sold by the Israeli military to Iran for the Iranian Revolution, and then sold or supplied to the Hezbollah by the Iranian government later. And this shows how even Israeli arms exports are sometimes used against Israeli forces themselves. Now I want to talk a little bit about what exactly is the Israeli arms industry, what do they produce, how, and these are the logos of the four biggest Israeli arms companies that together manage or control the vast majority of the production and the export of Israeli weapons. We have IAI, Israeli Aerospace Industries, which is government-owned, the biggest company, followed by Elbit Systems, which is the biggest private company, and followed by IMI, the Israeli Military Industries, which is the oldest company still owned by the government, followed by Rafael, which is also owned by the government. So you have only one private company, but the Israeli government is very anxious about trying to privatize these companies as fast as possible. They're trying to privatize both Rafael and IAI in a staged process, gradually, but with IMI they're trying to sell the whole company as fast as possible. The problem is, only one company made a bid to buy IMI, and that company is Elbit Systems. And if Elbit Systems buys IMI, so we'll have only three companies, Elbit will have a monopoly over selling weapons to the Israeli government, to the Israeli army, in many of the sectors, in many types of weapons, and that is something that will undoubtedly increase the Israeli defense budget because they can increase the prices. So that whole project is now stuck because nobody really wants to buy this company. And I think that's very interesting, and maybe later I hope I can make you understand a little bit why this company is not so attractive. Okay, so when talking about the Israeli arms exports, we should put it in context. Who are the biggest arms exporters of the world? Certainly not Israel. Even though this is the topic of this evening's talk, I don't want you to get the wrong impression that Israel controls the arms market in the world. The biggest arms exporter in the world by far is the United States. And if you can read the numbers, I hope you can, you'll see the United States exports more weapons than all the other countries in the world together. And that's followed by Russia, France, Germany, Italy, China, and then Israel, number 7. But I think if we, I think maybe there's another way to look at it, and I added two, so these numbers are from the US State Department. This is American statistics. I've added to it these two columns on the right, where I add the population of each one of these countries, and then divide the export by the population. So we get a very strange kind of economic idea, per capita weapons export. How much weapons does an average person in Germany, how many weapons do they export? Which, of course, we have to understand. This is just an average. It's really not a very good economic indicator of what really a person does. But then we find something very interesting. We find that the United States is not the biggest per capita exporter in the world. It's number 2. And the number 1 is Israel. Israel sells more weapons per person than any other country in the world. On average, every Israeli sells weapons worth $889 every year, which is quite a lot. But I assure you that I'm an Israeli. I never sold any weapons in my life, and I certainly didn't get any part of that money, nor have 99% of Israelis. They also don't share in that money and in that industry. This is only a very, very small group of people who own these companies, and they actually are the biggest exporters inside the Israeli economy. And that's very important to remember, but it does tell us something about how the Israeli economy itself is structured. It tells us that there is no other country in the world for which weapons export are as important as they are for Israel, not even the United States. According to former Minister of Defense Ehud Barak, 150,000 households in Israel are either directly or indirectly related to the arms industry. And I've calculated that about 11% of all the exports from Israel are arms exports. 11% means that 89% of exports from Israel are not military, are not weapons. The majority. Nevertheless, there is no country in the world that has such a high proportion of its exports for the military. So this is something in the form of arms exports. So this is something that does identify Israel as a very militarized kind of economy. And one of the problems is that we don't really know how to measure the distribution between weapon industries and homeland security industries. The whole security sector is very entangled with the military sector. In fact, all the 4 big companies that I showed you before, IAI, IMI, Rafael, and Elbit, they all have a very large homeland security sector inside their own company, and they don't tell us how their exports are divided between the two. So that's important to keep in mind. And here there's a graph that was created by an Israeli civil society organization called ARMED, or Hamushim in Hebrew. ARMED is a group of activists who try to explain to the Israeli public itself what is the significance of this very militarized economy. So they calculated the arms export as a proportion of the GDP. So, of course, GDP is not just made of exports. GDP is made of all aspects of the economy. But you can see how much does the arms export contribute to GDP. And then you see that Israel is number 1 in the world, with 1% of GDP coming from the arms exports. Germany number 2 with 0.88%. So actually the United States is only number 4. Okay, so let's talk about what kind of technology is produced by Israel. And I remind you of this argument between the specialization school and the self-sufficiency school. What does the Israeli arms industry specialize in? They specialize, first of all, in technology that complements and works with US technology. The best example is the helmets produced by Elbit Systems, which are designed to be worn by pilots of US-made F-16 aircraft. That means there's no competition, because nobody will buy this helmet unless they already own the aircraft. And that's how the companies learn to act in symbiosis with the US companies instead of in competition. But over the years, more and more these companies specialize not in military technology for the purpose of winning wars, and more in technology for control of civilian populations. And that brings us to this whole issue of homeland security. And where a lot of this technology is used, especially in areas of extreme inequality, where there's large populations that are oppressed socially and economically, and protest this kind of treatment. And then in order to crush their protests, this kind of technology is needed. Technology that is not needed to win wars, but actually incarceration technology, things like handcuffs and leg cuffs, shockers to control protesters and neutralize them, drones to follow their movement and take pictures of them, biometric machines to collect biometric data from people, the kind of machines that you see today in airports, and that you yourself have to go through when you're traveling by plane through that. And so that brings us to this issue of homeland security. I want to give you one example of an Israeli general called Gal Hirsch, a rather famous general because in 2006, when Israel invaded Lebanon, he was in charge of the northern command of the Israeli forces, and that war went very badly for Israel. And it's the same war as I talked before, with Hezbollah ambushing some Israeli soldiers, and then Israel invaded Lebanon, caused massive devastation and destruction, killing a lot of people, but not really being able to defeat the Hezbollah. And Gal Hirsch, the general, he was humiliated by that, and his military career was over. He had to leave the military. So, like many other Israeli officers, he started his own weapons company. In Israel, that's very common and encouraged by the Ministry of Defense. So he started his own weapons company, and he went to Georgia. In Georgia, he convinced the Georgian government to buy Israeli weapons. And the prestige of the Israeli army is so strong that the Georgian government was convinced that if they armed themselves with Israeli weapons, they will be able to stop the Russian army. And in 2008, as there was war between Russia and Georgia, and as I'm sure you know, the Georgian army collapsed immediately. Of course, they were not able to stop the Russian army with Israeli weapons. But I think it's interesting that they imagined that they could, that they have this image of the Israeli army as this super powerful group that can somehow defeat everything in their path, which is of course not true, because Israeli soldiers, no Israeli soldier has actually ever fought in a conventional war. The last conventional war that the Israeli army has engaged in was in 1973, which is 43 years ago. So the youngest soldiers from that war are already retired. The Israeli soldiers have a lot of experience chasing after children who are throwing stones. That is not the kind of experience that lets you win wars. It's the kind of experience that is needed by a colonial army which is policing a civilian population. So that's why Homeland Security becomes a sector that is much more attractive for the customers of Israeli weapons. And indeed, you see that a lot of forces, like I mentioned, India and in Brazil as well, are sending their soldiers, sending their police to be trained in Israel. I hear that also in the Netherlands, but I'm not the one who will talk to you about this. Sending them to Israel to learn how the Israeli army is conducting their operations. How do they control a civilian population? And up to the point that there is one neighborhood in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, which the local police calls the Gaza Strip, because they are implementing all the technology from the Gaza Strip, drones, checkpoints that they buy from Israel. And because of that, we can also identify who are the biggest customers, who are the biggest buyers of Israeli technology. And indeed, here we see a very interesting list. This is based on a database that was conducted by an activist and a scholar of the arms trade called Jimmy Johnson. And he collected hundreds of deals by Israeli companies and various customers. And from that, I constructed this very rough estimate of the biggest customers of Israeli weapons, because, of course, much of that information is confidential and we don't really have access to it. And of course, the United States is number one, because that's not surprising. There's a lot of reciprocal deals between Israel and the US. But then we have India, which is actually today a bigger customer than the United States. But this table shows us an accumulated export from 1950 until today. So India is still not number one here, but if you just look at the last couple of years, then it is number one. And then we have China, Turkey, Turkey has especially found use for Israeli technology in fighting against the Kurds. Then we've got Singapore. South Africa is on the list, but mainly for the period of time until the fall of apartheid. During apartheid, South Africa was a very big customer of Israeli weapons. Then we've got Chile, but again, it's restricted to the period of time during Augusto Pinochet's control of Chile. Guatemala during the Civil War years. Then Brazil that I mentioned, and finally France, but this is only until the embargo of 1967. Yeah, so this is something that, of course, affects the Israeli economy as well, because all of this investment in security and all of these companies have to sell their products, first of all, to the Israeli army before they can export it. Because of that, Israel has a very, very high defense budget. As proportion of the GDP, Israel's defense expenditure, or security expenditure, is, according to official numbers, 6.5%. According to unofficial numbers that include a wider array of expenditure, we see more than 12%. 12% makes Israel the highest spender on security as proportion of GDP in the world. So there's no other country that spends more than that. And that has long-term effects on the Israeli society, including a very ironic kind of effect, that because of the social decline inside Israel and the growing social gaps, meaning also lack of solidarity between different groups, then it makes more and more Israelis refuse to go to the army or try to avoid military service. The rate of conscription is falling constantly. And today the conscription rate in Israel is actually 48%, which means even though it's obligatory by law for everyone to go to serve in the army, 52% of young Israelis find one way or another to avoid military service. So that, and the way that the Israeli Ministry of Defense responds is by hiring private companies to take the jobs that used to be done by soldiers. And then these private companies sell their services to the Israeli Ministry of Defense and then export the same services to other countries around the world. Somehow the Israeli arms industry is very strong and a very big exporter, but actually if we look at the last few years, there is a decline in Israeli arms sale. We see a lot of people like Gal Hirsch that I mentioned after this crisis in the war in Georgia. His company went bankrupt. He tried to go back to Israel and become the chief of police. But all of his previous business scandals have surfaced, and he didn't get that job in the end. And like him, there are many other generals, officers who try to make a living in the arms industry, but find that there's not enough demand for their services. One of the reasons I believe that this demand is gradually declining is that all of this very impressive technology developed by the Israeli arms companies is actually failing to achieve its one objective that they keep promising. It does not repress the Palestinian resistance. Meaning that even though every Palestinian is surveilled by Israeli drones and the Israeli companies take their biometric information and issue magnetic cards that they have to carry everywhere, even though Palestinians are killed from the air with missiles, arrested in the thousands, tortured, there are so many different technologies used against them, but the Palestinians continue to resist. They continue to protest. And as long as they continue to resist, the customers of Israeli weapons, they go to the armed trade fairs that are opened in Tel Aviv to showcase all of these Israeli technologies, and they ask, well, you have this new missile that costs $1 million. Did this missile solve your political problems? Of course not. So why should we buy it? And over time, you see a decline in the arms export, I believe because of that reason. Of course, you don't have to agree with me, and we can have a discussion. But I think that the last Israeli invasion of Gaza in the summer of 2014 was a very important watershed moment, because that invasion lasted for 51 days. It was very, very long. And during the 51 days, the Palestinians in Gaza refused to surrender. there were only about 10,000 armed Palestinians trying to resist the Israeli military invasion. Israel sent an armed force more than 10 times bigger into Gaza to try to control that resistance and to stop it, and they failed. And they used all of their advanced armor personnel carriers and the famous Iron Dome system to intercept Palestinian rockets and anti-sniper systems and all that. But in the end, this invasion of Gaza, in addition to destroying the Gaza economy and killing over 2,000 Palestinians, it has also caused a lot of damage to the Israeli economy. Until today, the Israeli tourism to Israel did not recover from the loss of tourism that happened during that war. So that means that in the end, this technology did not allow Israel to continue as normal. And for the first time after this invasion, the arms fair that was opened right after the invasion. After every invasion, there is an arms fair where the new weapons and technologies are being showcased. But for the first time, this arms fair was not successful. The exports did not increase. And last year, the big 4 companies that I showed you before sent an urgent letter to the Israeli Prime Minister and said, we need government support to our companies because otherwise we might need to fire thousands of workers. Our exports are plummeting very fast. One of the reasons for that is also the BDS movement, but I think I'll leave that for the discussion. And I'll just conclude by saying something about the relevance of this to a discussion here. Why should we even be interested in that story here in Amsterdam? Here's a quote from an Israeli chemist by the name of Israel Shachak, who studied the Israeli arms trade. He said, from Rhodesia to apartheid South Africa to the Gulf monarchies, Israel ties its interest not with the masses fighting for freedom, but with their jailers. And indeed, if we look at the political scape in Europe today, we see something very interesting. We see right-wing parties all over Europe being very, very pro-Israel. We see left parties all over Europe being in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. I think the Netherlands is actually a very good example of this, with Geert Wilders calling on Israel to build more colonies in the West Bank. Why for him does it matter if Israel builds colonies in the West Bank or not? You don't see him going to countries around the world and telling them what their policies should be, but he is interested in the Israeli occupation in the West Bank. And I think he is interested in that because it's a model. Because Israel is not just exporting the technology, they're also exporting the legitimacy to use that kind of technology against civilians. And if Israel can arrest somebody just because they're an Arab or a Muslim, then maybe Geert Wilders wants the Dutch police to be able to do the same here. And if there's an Israeli company that promises to have a special algorithm that they use on Facebook that can trace if somebody, according to their Facebook posts, is a terrorist or a security threat, and based on that information, the security forces can arrest that person or interrogate them, then this is a kind of invasion of privacy and invasion of civil liberties that right-wing parties all over Europe and also in North America and other places around the world want to copy. And they support the Israeli government because if the Israeli government can do that, then why not they as well? So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.